dimensional quantities. And so you also have temporal extent. Who can tell me what temporal is? So whenever I'm like thinking about it, I always try to break down the word. So temporal, what is temporal? Temporal, I always think about like tiempo, time, where we are in time.
Yeah.
So I always think about tiempo, where we are in time. So every instance of a behavior occurs during some amount of time.
And temporal extent is the duration.
Yes, yes, temporal extent is going to be your duration. So we want to know how long the behavior is occurring. And then temporal locus. What does locus mean?
Point.
Yeah, like where it is located. So if you say it in Spanish, like locación, like where it's located. So temporal locus, every instance of a behavior occurs at a certain point in time in respect to other events. Examples, when behavior occurs can be measured. Oh, that just confused me. When behavior occurs can be measured. Oh, when it occurs. So where in the timeline it's happening. So does it happen in the morning, in the evening, in the middle of the day? So where it occurs in time. Okay, measures based on repeatability. So that is basically saying continuous measurement, right? Can somebody help me remember? Continuous measurement is
So that's count, right? Count, rate.
yeah, count, rate, and so it's frequency, rate, and duration. And there's got to be something else.
Acceleration.
Acceleration, like how fast? Oh yes, is that like latency? Okay, so then we talk about the different measures based on repeatability. So we have count, and that is going to be like frequency. So that's just tallying how many times the behavior occurs. So you can use a clicker and click, click, click every time it happens. You can tally every time it happens. So all of those are examples of count. So count is frequency. We want to know every single instance that behavior occurs. So that's why they call it continuous measurement, because you're going to continue to track data every single time. And then you have rate. So rate, who can tell me what rate is?
So that has a unit of time in it. How many behaviors per whatever your unit of time?
Yes. So rate is going to be how many times the behavior occurs. So frequency over time. Frequency over time is going to give me a percentage. So who can tell me why you would use rate versus frequency? So put your BCBA hat on and be like, why would I choose a rate over a frequency? I'll give you the answer. So the reason why you would use rate over frequency would be because the observation periods are different amounts of time. So one person is watching the client for 30 minutes, and then the other person watches the client for 3 hours. So the aggression occurred in the 30-minute interval or whatever session once, and then you have the 3-hour guy and it says 152. So your data is going to be drastically different between the 30-minute guy and the 3-hour guy. So that would be a moment where you're like, okay, this certain setting, it's not appropriate for me to use frequency or rate because the observers are not observing for the same amount of time. So that's why you would want to choose a rate measurement versus a frequency, or what they're calling it in the book is count. But yeah, so that's the difference between the two. And then you have IRT.
So count is the same as frequency.
Yes, count is frequency, but they're calling it count in Cooper. And if that was what was blowing me or like throwing me off, it's frequency. So count and frequency is a tally. So we're just click, 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 click every time it happens. We don't care if it's a 30-minute session, 3-hour session, we don't care. We just want to know how many times it happens. But then you go to rate. I want to know how many times it happens, but I'm going to divide it by a certain amount of time because the people are observing for different amounts of time. And so I'm going to get a percentage, and that way my data could look nicer. So, and then you have the IRT. Who can tell me what IRT is?
Into response time.
Response time.
Yeah, inter-response time. So they want to know the time it took from one answer to the other answer. And the example that I always give is like, let's say I'm observing a child and I want to know how often he takes breaks, or how long or let's just say it's taking him a long time to complete a worksheet. So I'm going to observe him and I want to know how long his breaks are. Like how much time is he just messing around? So I give him a worksheet, and every time he's working, cool, he's working. But when he stops working, he puts his pencil down. I'm gonna, boom, start my timer. And I want to know how long it's going to take him to like mess around. He stems a little, he looks up at the sky, he picks his nose, and then the teacher has to prompt him back to the worksheet. And so then he finally picks up his pencil. So that time that it took between those two responses, that's the data that you're collecting. So that's inter-response time. Okay, any questions so far? Anybody have any examples to add? Who has actually looked through this book? Like, be honest. Before this class or before our meetings. It's actually really good stuff. Every time I read it, I find something new.
I mean, I've read it. I've read the previous Cooper one twice with the different courses. This one I'm just starting to get back into and going through it. So
yes, and
I
I
wasn't
really
certain what chapter you guys are on, so I figure I'll be better prepared next week.
yes, we're on chapter 4. But I really recommend reading this new book, because before I took my exam, I read all of the chapter summaries the day before, and there was certain terminology, like the way that they worded it, that was different, but I had remembered reading it in the book. So I was like, oh, it's probably that answer, because I remember that one being in one of the summaries or something like that. It really helped me. So I do recommend Cooper to everyone.
I'm also going through the glossary and looking at words and writing out the words that I haven't had in my card sets, like the different terms and stuff in the back of the book.
Yes, that's a good idea.
I don't know if that will help, but I just feel like there's different things that, I don't know.
You're talking about the Cooper 3rd edition, right? 'Cause that's
Yes,
the only
this-
one I've ever had. So
This big fatty one.
yeah.
I have the other one.
You have both of them?
I have the little one too.
Oh yeah, I have that one at work.
That's the 2nd edition.
Yes, that's the second.
Okay.
Okay, so then it briefly goes into discrete trials, which is cool because I don't remember reading about discrete trials in Cooper. So discrete trials are controlled by a given opportunity to emit the response. Typical discrete trials used in non-human animal laboratory studies include moving from one end of a maze or shuttle box to another. Applied examples of discrete trials include responding to teacher presented flashcards and answering a question prompted by the teacher. So I always think when I'm thinking about discrete trial, I always go back to DTT. So I always think about discrete trial training anytime I see any question about discrete trial. And that's where we're sitting down and maybe you're using a token board and you're running things really quickly. There's different ways of running your discrete trials. There's people that use flashcards, people that use real stimuli. I just recently started using virtual stimuli. So all different kinds of running discrete trials, but that's them sitting down and you're doing presenting SDs quickly in like an, what am I trying to say? In a very controlled environment. Okay, so then they talk about celeration. So celeration, who can tell me what celeration is?
Your response.
Celeration. Oh, what is the difference between celeration and duration?
Is the measure of how rates of response change over time.
Oh, yes, you're right, you're right. That's the one with the staircase graph. So celeration is like you add to, and then you add to more, and then you add to more, and then you add to more. And it's like a cumulative, right? So that's celeration, and then you got duration. So duration wants to know how long a behavior occurred. So how long did this happen? So what behavior, put your BCBA hat on, what examples would you use salary or duration, tracking duration? So what behavior would you use duration tracking for, duration measurement?
So somebody who's having like a temper tantrum, right?
Yeah, perfect.
You would,
A tantrum.
right.
You want to know how long it occurs. And then it goes into telling you the difference between duration per session and duration per occurrence. And this is actually also really cool because you're able to collect data in different ways. So duration per session, that would be me telling the therapist, and I have examples like this because I have clients, they have certain behaviors, and some of them I track as duration per session, and then there's some where I track duration per occurrence. So an example of duration per session, I want to know, so I have a client, let's say, theoretically, that is very non-compliant. So he, anytime you give him instruction, no, maybe goes hides under the table. It takes a long time for them to get him back to actually complete anything. So I'm going to start tracking non-compliance, but I just want to know how much time out of his whole learning session is this behavior occurring. So what I'll tell them is I'll say, I want you to take duration per session. So that means that you're going to pause and play the timer whenever it's occurring. So just pause it if it's not occurring, play it when it is occurring. Pause it when it's not occurring, play it when it is occurring. And that will tell me, like, let's say out of his 3-hour session, he engaged in non-compliance for 28 minutes. So that would be duration per session. Duration per occurrence would be like, let's say, for example, client has tantrums, really long tantrums, 20-minute tantrums. So I'm gonna start tracking duration per occurrence. I wanna see how long these behaviors are occurring. And then I'm gonna tell the therapist when the behavior has stopped, then you graph it. I need a data point for it. So I wanna know the duration for each occurrence. And so that's gonna show me how long all of these tantrums are lasting. So that, let's say when I drop my intervention line, all right, now we're gonna start teaching, or we're gonna give some type of replacement behavior, then you start to see your time decrease. So that's cool too. So those are the two different types of duration, and those are based off of temporal extent. Okay, temporal locus. Who wants to talk about latency? Who can tell me what latency is? Based
So
off-
latency is from when you present the SD to when the behavior occurs.
Yeah, perfect. So I want to know how long it's taking for him to actually respond. Maybe he has a hard time sitting and attending. But I introduced some attending goal, and so now I want to know now how long is it taking for him to respond? So that would be a time when you are going to take latency. Any other examples of when you would track a latency behavior? You guys are quiet today. Okay, we talked about IRT. Percentage is a ratio performed by combining the same dimensional quantity such as count. So that's going to be like rate. We take a percentage. What about trials to criterion? Who can tell me a little bit about trials to criterion?
How many times it takes you to reach the criterion?
Yeah. So I always feel like it's kind of like shaping. So you set a small goal, and then once they master that one, then you increase the time or something like that. So you're kind of like just adding on. Is a measure, okay, so trials of criterion is a measure of the number of response opportunities needed to achieve a predetermined level of performance. Okay. Topography. I feel like we already talked about topography, but who can tell me what topography is? This is like a word as a BCBA that you're going to use a lot.
What the behavior looks like.
Yes, exactly. The topography is your what. So what does it look like? And the function is your
Why?
yes, perfect, Jen. So topography is your what and the function is your why. So those are the two things that we're looking at. We want to know, what does the behavior look like? Why is it occurring? And those are going to be your everyday questions in your BCBA brain. So topography is telling us the actual physical form or shape of a behavior is measurable and malleable dimensions of behavior. So basically, long story short, what it looks like. Magnitude, who can tell me about magnitude?
The intensity.
Yeah, the intensity. So how fast, how hard, all of that is going to be the magnitude. So when you're measuring behavior, maybe you're measuring SIB. And when he engages in SIB, he's banging his head on the glass so hard that it shatters every time. But then I introduce some type of intervention, and now he's just banging his head ever so lightly and the glass doesn't shatter, or something like that, something very observable that you can measure the magnitude, and that's gonna be the way that you show that your intervention is indeed working. So all different types of measurement that are trying to basically you're trying to make a pretty graph. So how am I going to make my graph look pretty? That's what it is at the end of the day. So then you have event recording, so methods for measuring behavior. Event recording. That's kind of like what we were talking about with continuous measurement. So those are going to be all of the ones that we just talked about: count, rate, acceleration, duration, latency, inner response time. There's a beautiful table here that I wish I would have known or like looked at earlier that gives us all of them and their definitions and examples.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. It's like you have to turn your book sideways.
Yeah.
Yes, it's beautiful. I love that. So maybe reference back to this table because it's telling you the measurement, how it's calculated, and their considerations. So maybe why you would use it and when to use it.
It's 3 pages.
Wow, yeah, and then it
Yeah.
has the trials to criterion, topography, and magnitude. So go back and look at that table when you guys are studying to make sure that you are clear on all of the different types of measurement and which one you should pick for that certain behavior, because they might ask you some applied questions like that, like, oh, child is engaging in really long tantrums. What behavior measurement would you use or something like that? And I might do duration. And then for something that has a clear beginning and end, those are the ones that you could use frequency and rate. So that's a good thing to a consideration to remember is that if it has a clear beginning and end, like every time he slaps his peer, that has a clear beginning and end. So I can track that as rate or frequency, depending on what I want, because I'm able to count it, like they said in here, count. Okay, so then they go into time sampling. So time sampling, those are going to be your discontinuous measurements. So who can tell me why we call it discontinuous? So the other ones that we just talked about, those were continuous measurements. I'm taking data every single time it happens. And then discontinuous measurement, I'm doing what?
So you have a period, some type of interval that you're using, and then you're either measuring a point in time during the interval. So is it happening at all during the interval? Is it happening the whole interval? Or is it just happening at the end of the interval?
Yes, exactly. So we're not tracking every single time the behavior occurs anymore. So let's say before they were tracking every single time they engaged in vocal stereotypy, let's just say. But then you realize like, this is not appropriate for my therapist to be tracking every single time his vocal stereotypy occurs because it occurs so frequent that she's just sitting there staring at him, click, 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 click. So that's not appropriate for me to use continuous measurement on that behavior because it occurs way too often. So then that's when I would be like, okay, we need to track this as some type of discontinuous measurement. So that's when you go into learning about all of the different time samples and which one you should use and why. And so I'm sure you guys have studied those like crazy. I'm sure you guys all have examples of, isn't there like a whole over interval or something like that?
Oh, yes.
Just different ways to study it and remember which measurement you should use at what moment. But I guess for now, we can go over the different time samples. That'll be pretty easy, pretty basic. So whole interval recording. So when are we tracking the behavior for whole interval?
The entire interval.
Yes, perfect. You're tracking it for the whole time. So I'm splitting it up into intervals. I'll give you guys like a real life example. I'm splitting it up into intervals and I'm telling them to collect data on I don't know, somebody give me an example. Let's just say spitting. He's like constantly spitting every second of his life. Well, not every second, but let's say like 80% of the time he's just spitting. So I might track that behavior as a whole interval. So I want to know, did it occur for the entire 5 minutes? Yes or no? And they're like, oh, no, it didn't occur. That's kind of a gross example, but so yeah, you just want to know if the behavior occurred for the entire time. And that's when the therapist will collect the data. So either yes, it occurred, or no, it did not occur for the entire interval. Who has a better example of a behavior that you would track using a whole interval?
Like
Oh, cool.
if you're tracking on task, like let's say like doing homework or something, or like classwork, if they wanted to track how long one student can stay on task basically. So if they were on task the entire time for like, 10 seconds, then that would be a plus. If during the next 10-second interval, they, let's say they like stop and get distracted and then go and like at 8 seconds, they start going back on track, that wouldn't count as a whole interval because they weren't attending the entire time.
Yes, perfect. And I just thought about it. That makes more sense to track something that is like something you want. So behavior you want to increase, right? Something appropriate. So like in over here, it says cooperative play, or what I think is like a DRO. Does anybody know what a DRO is?
Differential reinforcement of other behavior. So it would be reinforcement of any other behavior, not the problem behavior, not the behavior, right?
Yes. So for a DRO, I'll give you guys an example. So let's say, and so those are going to be tracked kind of their intervals. So for a DRO, for let's say hand flapping, client engages in high levels of hand flapping. So I'm going to start them on a DRO. I'm going to give some type of signal, let's say a bracelet or a green card that's telling her when she, or like, okay, when we have our bracelet on, that means we need to have quiet hands. So I start at like 5-second interval. So I want to know, did the behavior occur during those 5 seconds? Yes or no? And if it did not occur in those 5 seconds, then she gets access to reinforcement. So that's kind of like whole interval recording. And so for DROs, you run those back to back to back to back. So I'm going to do, let's say 5 trials. So does she engage in hand flapping for those 5 seconds? No. Boom, she gets a 30-second break. And then once her break is over, we put the bracelet back on. Does she engage in hand flapping for 5 seconds when the bracelet's on? No. All right, boom, she gets her break. And then the next interval, does she engage in hand flapping when her bracelet is on? Yes, she did. So I had to pause the timer, restart that interval. I had to give her an X for that interval, and then I had to reset the timer again. So that is something, the way that my brain works and what I would think when I'm thinking about whole interval recording. I hope that was a good example.
It was.
Okay, whole interval. What about partial interval? What do you want to know for a partial interval?
So partial interval is, did it happen at all during the, like, at some point during the interval?
Yes, so did it occur at all in those 5 minutes, yes or no? So an example, we can go back to the example that she was talking about with the on-task behavior. So let's say we're observing Selena and we're observing her in a partial interval. And we want to know if she was writing at any point during that interval. So we maybe start her with small intervals and we want to know, did she engage in the behavior at all? So let's say she engaged in it for 1 second, she's going to get a check mark. It doesn't matter if she engaged in it for the whole time or where in time, maybe it was the last second. But because she did engage in that behavior during those 5 seconds, I'm going to give her a check. So that's partial. I want to know, did it occur at any time in that interval? And then you have momentary time sample. So who can tell me about momentary time?
So this would be like, this is mostly used for teachers also, I think, because they set a timer and when they look up, they basically look up to see, like if we're talking about the on-task behavior, let's say the teacher sets a timer for like 30 seconds. And once that timer goes up, she'll look up and she'll see if that student is engaging on task behavior, that would be a plus. But if she looks up and that client isn't, it would be a minus. So it's whatever's happening at that the end
Yeah,
of the interval.
Right, because that one, you don't have to spend the interval. Sorry,
Let-
watching, you're just gonna check it at the end. Are they doing it or not?
yes, and that's why it's perfect to use those type of data collection methods for teachers, because it's easier for her, for me to give her, hey, can you take a discontinuous measurement for me? Versus me telling her, hey, I want you to take a measurement every single time he hand flaps. That teacher is gonna hate me and be like, no, I'm not doing that.
So I have this visual here from a class that I had taken with the
Okay.
partial and the whole. So the partial they have on top with the arrow going down because it underestimates frequency, but overestimates duration. And then the whole overestimates.
Yeah, I couldn't understand that design. So I had to like think about it in a different way, but I know that one is helpful too.
I think the helpful thing for me was continuous measurements measures discontinuous behavior, and discontinuous measurement measures continuous behavior.
Oh yes, that one is like mind blowing because I've been teaching this stuff like every single day. I was an RBT trainer before I was a BCBA, so I taught them all these basics. But when I read that, it blew my mind.
Like the way,
Can you put that in the chat so I can copy it down, please? Like what
Which
you
one?
just said.
Yes, write it in the chat for them. Okay, so momentary time, we wanted to know, did it occur at the moment of the beep? Okay, what about planned activity check? That one's gonna be for group behavior. So a teacher using a planned activity check observes a group of students and at the end of each time interval counts the number of students engaged in the target activity and records a tally with the total number of students in the group. Okay, cool. That would be more in a school setting. Measuring behavior by permanent product. Okay, so permanent product, it leaves a lasting impression. So like she said in the example of like them video recording the client and then going back and watching it. So you have a permanent product. Another example is like a math worksheet. So how many did he actually complete? He turns in the worksheet. I have a permanent product. I can count how many he actually completed. Or trash bags. I asked my son to take out the trash and I see 2 trash bags on the curb. I could count them, 1, 2. That was a permanent product that he left that I was able to measure, and that told me whether or not he engaged in the behavior or not. So yeah, perfect. We know what a permanent product is. That one is in the RBT exam. Is anybody in RBT here?
I was in RBT, but then once I got my master's, I stopped being an RBT. But yeah, I took the test and everything.
Yeah, it has a lot of those that terminology. So it really helps me to remember it because I was constantly repeating myself when I was training RBTs. Okay, so measurement by permanent product enables data collection on more participants. So that's 1 plus of permanent product is I can observe more than 1 person. Facilitates data collection for inter-observer agreement to ensure treatment integrity. So I'm able to go back and check my data because I can watch it over and over and over. So that's another benefit of using permanent product. It enables measurement of complex behaviors and multiple response classes. So let's say a client is really aggressive and let's say they had to put him in some type of hold, but it all happened so quickly that you don't even really know what happened. But thank goodness we have a camera because now I'm able to watch it back and see, okay, what happened during that time? What was the antecedent? What was the behavior? What was the consequence? How many times did he hit her? How many times did he try to choke her? All of that stuff is easier to see through permanent products. So it helps us measure complex behaviors and multiple response classes. Okay. Determining whether measurement by permanent product is appropriate. So is real-time measurement needed? Can the behavior be measured by permanent product? And it gives us some rules over here on page 95. Rule 1, each occurrence of the target behavior must produce the same permanent product. Okay. Rule 2, the permanent product can be produced only by the target behavior. And then knowing the difference between low-tech and high-tech measurement tools. So some examples of low-tech, pencil, wrist counters, tally counters, abacus wrist and shoestring counters, masking tape, pennies, buttons, paper clips. Those are all quick examples of low-tech measurements. And then you have high-tech measurements. So in your guys' settings, do you guys take paper data or do you take like some type of technology data?
Yeah, technology data, central reach.
Okay, cool. I am also central reach. Anybody else?
We use Theranest, but I also do both because some of my like my RBTs are more comfortable taking paper data and then transferring it to Theranos at the end of the day. So we kind of use both.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what is the easiest for the therapist. So for like a time sample, I like to use paper data because the tablet is unreliable. Like let's say it dies or it exits out and now her time sample's all messed up because her clock stopped running or something like that. Versus if she was taking paper data, she could just be looking at the clock and circling whether the behavior occurred or not. So that would be an example of when I would use paper data. But for the most part, we do use Central Reach. But before that, I worked at a clinic where it was all paper data. So there's like pros and cons to both of them. So paper data, it's more time consuming. Electronic data, you're able to get to analyze the data quicker versus like the paper data, I'm gonna have to go input it. And then by the time it takes me to input it, then days later, I'm able to observe the graph versus with the electric data, it's just like, boom, every time it happens, the data is kind of cumulative, just occurring in that moment in time. So that's kind of nice. Selecting a measurement method. So this chapter is almost done and we did it by 7:30. All our other chapters have been going 2 sessions. So I guess measurement was pretty easy.
Yeah.
So selecting a measurement method should balance the resources. Oh, so that's kind of what I just talked about, is like knowing which one is more appropriate at that time, what's more beneficial, what is the therapist able to do, and all of that. Sometimes I like if I'm tracking a high frequency behavior and it's I want them to do a lot of them. So like let's say manding or something like that, I might have them tally it on the clicker because the clicker is so much easier to get to that they could just like buckle it on themselves and click, 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 and then later transfer it onto the electronic version or the electronic data. So that would be a difference between low tech, high tech, and when I use it is when they're in session, they're able to access the clicker quicker, boom, boom, boom. And then later on, they might transfer it to the high tech measurement tool.
Yeah, I use the same thing. I use all like count data because it's easier for my RBTs and my BHTs to count